everyone? Welcome back to the Red Lettuce. With us, we have Angie Speaks.
Hello.
But we are so excited to have her on. We've been trying to get her on for a while, and finally our schedules match up. And we're just gonna talk a bunch of shit. But Angie is the host of her own YouTube show called Angie Speaks, and she's a co-host of the Low Society podcast. Angie, welcome. We are so
Thank
happy to have you.
you. Thank you. And I'm glad to finally be here because it's been long overdue.
We are too. We're so excited to have you on. We love what you've been up to.
Thank you.
But before we get into the topics, why don't you just let people know a little more about yourself? You're a really big content creator on YouTube. Your work is really well done. We really enjoy what you put out there. So let us know how you got into becoming a very political YouTube content creator, and why are people trying to cancel you all the time?
Oh, well, okay. So I started out just like as your run-of-the-mill kind of wide-eyed liberal left, true believer kind of person. And it was like sort of during the sort of Trumpian era, just like in the sort of very beginning kind of wave of that. And there was a wave of content creators that came up during that time who were sort of making content debunking the alt-right, and it became very sort of tedious and tiresome, and it was sort of its own industrial complex of like chud dunking and sort of profiting from outrage. So I started my channel originally because I noticed these trends, as even though I was still somewhat of a bit of a rad lib, I still kind of saw how the YouTube environment and how the social media environment really fostered a toxic discourse, a toxic political discourse. And I guess my channel was like my way of trying to redirect some of that energy into more productive energy. So even though I was coming from a more liberal left perspective, I was still sort of criticizing the liberal left in a lot of my earlier videos, and sort of criticizing the affect of the liberal left and the discourse within liberal left circles. And then obviously, because I started my channel when I was 24 or 23, I'm now 27. So grown up a lot. I've also evolved politically. I've read more, and I've kind of arrived at a sort of broader Marxist analysis. And the broader Marxist analysis kind of helped me understand why the environment was so toxic, why the discourse was so toxic, like how it had been influenced by this sort of neoliberal mode around the accumulation of social capital and personality and all of these different things, and also how having a punitive discourse also benefits like capitalist ideological reproduction. And my criticism started sort of veering away from the sort of liberal left criticism and became more explicitly Marxian and more explicitly pointed at criticisms of this kind of neoliberal mode. And that's where the cancelling comes in. A lot of the people who I initially attracted thought that I was like their like bread tube superstar, and were like bitterly disappointed when the product within the consumer market ceased to behave accordingly. So yeah, it's been my trajectory has sort of been a very public evolution. That's also kind of been I'm sort of in a transitional phase at the moment, I guess I would say, in terms of trying to make more pointed and explicit Marxist critiques of culture and the status quo as it is. And of course, that gets met with a lot of pushback from the more left, liberal, consumery demographic. But it's not something I'm not used to at this point. It's been basically like my last like 2 to 3 years.
Are you sure it's not because Marxism is for white people?
Oh yeah, I've heard that
Are you
one.
culturally appropriating Karl Marx?
I've made your culture into my prom dress, and I should be I should be punished accordingly. But yeah, it's the sort of identitarian, like obsessed, sort of bourgeois ideology that I tend to go pretty hard against, in favor of a more universalist class-based politics. And that tends to rub a lot of people like the wrong way, especially those who are like using politics as a place to source like narcissistic supply rather than as a place of like collective achievement.
I've experienced a lot of that backlash, especially during this past presidential election here. I've like gotten numerous like messages from people who I thought were my friends, people I didn't know, like famous activists in the city, like, you know, just being just really shitty because I like don't think that, you know, electoral politics is what's gonna make life easier for people and life's better. And so when I say like, yeah, Trump and Joe Biden are the fucking same, like nobody wants to hear that because they want to get rid of Trump so badly. And they, you know, they think that they're like, oh, you support children in cages, and I'm just like, well, they're still in cages, and they're president now. So
no, now they're you know, luxury child units or whatever the fuck that they call them, whatever
facilities.
Yeah, like whatever.
They're holding facilities now.
It's so silly, and yeah, who thought that being a Marxist isn't a good way of making friends?
Right.
This has also been very much my experience, especially around again like this election as well. You know, friends turning against you, people sort of associating any form of dissidence against, you know, these sort of liberal left lines, and they're sort of equating it with being a bigot or being far right or being complicit towards fascism. You also have the pernicious accusation of class reductionism, of Strasserism, all of these different sort of.
I've been called both of those things. I've been called Strasserist and I'm just like, y'all don't even, do you know what you're talking about? I don't
know. No one does. They just throw out words like Nosball, like they throw that out like they know what that means.
No, it's an innate fear of you know, the working class like uniting. A lot of these people are sort of out of touch with reality. Like for instance, in London recently, there was a huge, you know, victory for Labour victory with Uber, where there was a union that was able to put enough pressure on the court system to have Uber employees be given the rights of employees, and also given a fair wage, and they managed to win that battle and win that fight, which is a very good Labour victory. And those are people coming from all kinds of different backgrounds, some of whom are like conservative Muslims who probably wouldn't be on board with any of the sort of you know, liberal kind of cultural projects, who certainly wouldn't be on board with some socially progressive opinions. But does that mean that they as workers don't deserve rights? Does that mean that you can't work with people who come from a more conservative mentality in order to unite around shared aims and experiences? But because a lot of them live exclusively online and they're sort of these atomized, you know, consumer subjects that are socially disembedded and don't do a lot of interacting with the real world, the idea of people from different ideological, cultural backgrounds coming together is something that they feel is impossible unless that everybody's like sort of morally means tested, if you know what I mean. They want to sort of morally means test people into seeing whether they're worthy of like uniting with, are you woke on this? Are you woke on that? Are you, it's silly and totally like out of touch.
Yeah, because that's one of the topics I want to talk to you about, because you recently did a video addressing class reductionism. Because there's we see a lot of rad libs, bread tubers like Vosh, the synthetic left, use this term to attack people like you and Adolph Reed, and not to mention with a lot of racial undertones. Because people like you and Adolph Reed bring a class analysis to the table. Let's talk about why liberal identity politics is bullshit, and why these people hate class politics, and they claim that the discussion of class somehow ignores people's identities. And since this is not correct, what's their goal in using this made-up term?
So yeah, the video that I made actually was spurred after Vosh had called me a class reductionist on his I think it was like a stream. And obviously because he has a very large audience, much larger than I could probably ever conceive of having myself, that sort of thing travels, and people are conditioned to listen and believe to their thought leaders. And
Yeah.
when they say class reductionist, what they really mean is somebody who harbors, these sort of implicit bigotries against other people, and who is only concerned about their own sort of material gain. That's sort of the accusation that's being levied. But it was very interesting to see how, especially during the Bernie moment as well, how that was sort of weaponized to call anybody, or to imply that anybody who sort of adopts a class-based focus is a bad actor, an obfuscator, somebody who is, somebody who's using class as an excuse to ignore the plights of, these disparate communities, even though class is one of the most important and pressing lenses to view reality through, especially in this time. The fact of the matter is, the accusation of class reductionism is really a repeating of the Thatcher era "there are no alternative" kind of ethos. The idea that, this is all that there is, capitalist realism is all that there is, and any attempt to sort of challenge that through a class-based lens is deluding people into thinking that things can change. It's kind of a nihilism. The only sort of hope we have within the political realm is by going down the rabbit holes of these endless reductions of identity and trying to sort of produce new hierarchies out of those, categories of identity. And it's tiresome, it's tedious, and most people intuitively understand that it's not the way to achieve any sort of goals or aims that are going to affect us as a whole. Rather, you get a group of people who are sort of elevated as representatives of certain demographics and communities, and that are given class privileges in order to sort of pacify the rest of that group. And this is something that you see happening in a lot of marginalized quote unquote communities, like the Black community, for instance. There's a thriving Black bourgeoisie, and it's the Black bourgeoisie that mostly does the majority of the identity reductionist narcissism that ends up leaving the masses of the Black community, the working class and poor, utterly disenfranchised, utterly confused, and also completely disillusioned and unwilling to trust in political action, unwilling to occupy their political role, because they've been fucked over so many times by these people who have been able to use identity to sort of aggrandize themselves. But with the whole Vosh thing, it didn't matter to me. It was actually probably one of the best things that's happened to me so far, because before that I was sort of trying to undo things from the inside. I thought I was like, working on the inside type of thing. And by calling me out, he kind of made me realize that, like, no, I can't do that. Like, I have to separate myself from this liberal left identitarian milieu. There's no salvaging, there's no saving the synthetic left. The only thing that you can do is efficiently counteract their messages. You can't sort of work from within. So by calling me out, really and truly, it was like a moment from the universe that sort of prompted me to make that sort of final break and final like divorce from that mode.
Angie,
which I also think makes me more dangerous as well. So yeah.
We support dangerous women in this house.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, look, we've got Comrade Brittany and
we got Colleen
here. We support dangerous women.
Yes.
But Angie, how would you define the synthetic left, and what do you think is its biggest weakness?
And and I also want to add, like, do you see a synthetic left also in the UK versus here in London? I wonder if there's a difference between them.
Okay. All right. Wow. Okay, that's a big one. But first question first. How do I see the synthetic left? I see the synthetic left as the neoliberal mode sort of masquerading as radical. It's the neoliberal mode that sort of covered itself in the signifiers of radical politics, but really only ends up enforcing the status quo. Like all these sort of energy from the Bernie movement and also the Corbyn movement in the UK ended up getting funneled right back into the major neoliberal parties. Like in the US, all of the sort of momentum and energy from the Bernie movement ended up getting funneled right back into the DNC. And same thing with Black Lives Matter, same thing with Me Too, same thing with a lot of these different movements that have the aesthetics of radicalism and sort of take on this like radical stance, certain radical stances, but are really just the neoliberal mode operating underneath these kind of radical skins. You see it as well in terms of the media and in terms of what purports itself as like left media, BreadTube, all of this stuff, for instance. Even though they have these radical aesthetics, they still operate within the incentives of the neoliberal mode, which means selling the party line that's the most expedient for the DNC, being punitive discourse janitors, not allowing real conversations about class to take place, suppressing them where they see them, really using this sort of scorched earth approach to anything that could potentially challenge the status quo, while also kind of pretending to challenge the status quo. And I mean, in the US, at least you guys had the sort of, as ineffective as it was, at least you guys still had like the sort of dirtbag left phase, where you had certain people take on this kind of ironic stance against it, even though they were still kind of repeating the same patterns and modes. They took on this kind of ironic posture against like the excesses of the liberal left. But in the UK, we did not have our dirtbag phase. So we have some of the worst synthetic left rad libs in all areas of I mean, there are some certain areas where they stay away from, like trade unions are not necessarily invested with them. And I mean, there are certain parties and things that are, that they tend to be averse to, but for the most part, the Labour left and, a lot of sort of quote unquote left-wing organizations are completely infested with this kind of mentality, and in a completely unself-aware way, because we haven't been through the same sort of dirtbag left phase as America has. It's just like pure liberal narcissism in a way that, it's almost like pre-Trump kind of liberal narcissism. It doesn't have that like element of self-awareness to it. So yeah, in the UK, the rad libs here are much worse, much worse.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised to hear that. I mean, it's pretty bad here. Like, I didn't think it'd be worse.
Oh no, especially the class element of it is a lot more pronounced here as well, because class is generally more pronounced here. I mean, we're sort of still have a lot of the hangovers of like feudal society, and a lot of the people that tend to be at the helm of the synthetic left here in the UK are people who come from incredibly wealthy backgrounds. Class is a little bit more obscure because in America, because you guys still have the concept of middle class. And when Americans say middle class, they mean owns a house and a car. But in the UK, middle class means like gentry, somebody who's part of the gentry class. And, these are people that go to prestigious universities, who have parents that are members of the gentry, or parents who are very sort of highly skilled, educated professionals, who, then go through the university system, are sort of indoctrinated with the sort of neoliberal academic mentality. And then they start, to venture into politics and to use it as a platform for their egos, use it as a platform for their narcissistic impulses. And they have the power and the class power to do so. And they also have serious contempt for the working class. That's been my, experience. And they have the moral, they have the moral cover and the moral justification for their contempt for the working class through social justice. So it's okay that those people are suffering because they're evil white racists. It's okay that those people don't have the access to the resources they need because they voted for Brexit, or they supported a Tory candidate, or they are not woke on LGBT stuff or trans stuff or whatever. You know, that there's this sort of really pernicious moral justification now that exists for members of the elite who have deep contempt for the working class. And you sort of saw that manifest itself around Brexit and around the discourse that arose during the time. You saw this naked, ugly contempt coming from that milieu for, you know, the majority of the country who voted for that result.
Yeah, and I think this also goes into this, like I think you touched on this, but I want to dive into this a little more deeply. This narcissistic identity fetishism that we see, like we all saw this on Twitter, the aromantic awareness week, which is like when I saw that, I was like, nobody cares about your like Ayn Rand narcissistic like mentality. Like there's plenty of people that walk around like that. Nobody cares. I just want to touch on that because you tweeted about it, and I think your tweet that you sent out was really pretty much nailed it.
Thank you.
I just want to like read it so everyone hears it. You said the real reason people who are obsessed with narcissistic identity fetishism hate class politics is because it shifts attention to the collective, away from the individual, and denies the narcissistic supply and validation they are desperately seeking in the political domain. How is that not perfect?
Yeah, thank you. And it's, I'm not going to take full credit. I mean, I've been reading Christopher Lash's Culture of Narcissism and seeing some of the analysis that he has in that text, while also observing the mode that operates on Twitter, was what inspired me to sort of generate that take. Because a lot of what he describes in Culture of Narcissism is so poignant and so relevant in terms of how these sort of elite punitive discourses operate today, and also the hyper focus on identity within the synthetic left. Another thing, really interesting thing that Christopher Lash says, which is like a direct quote, I'll read it now. He said, "The cultural revolution of the modern left reproduces the worst features of the system that it claims to criticize. Cultural radicalism has become so pernicious in its unwitting support that it provides the status quo, that any criticism of contemporary society that hopes to get beneath the surface has to criticize at the same time much of what currently goes under the name of radicalism." And it's so true. Like, if you want to get under the surface of what's going on politically and how things are operating, we have to also criticize what claims to be radical, especially because a lot of these sort of radical cultural stances are now being used to codify and justify some of the most pernicious elements of the status quo. And we do exist within a context of narcissism. And narcissism is something that is deeply encouraged by our culture. Everything sort of caters towards that affect. So even people who aren't necessarily narcissistic are encouraged to behave so, especially within the world of Twitter, social media, media personality. It's all about sort of creating a facade, like a false self, and having people validate that false self. And it's all about sort of seeking narcissistic supply around specific issues or specific areas of your identity. And when it comes to narcissism and identity politics, you know, the aim of social justice used to be, my identity is not important, because the people who are making it important are the ones who are the bigots. But now the message of social justice is, my identity is the only thing that's important. And in order for that identity to continue to justify and perpetuate itself, I need this endless source, this endless stream of validation, of adulation, of praise. And it's very similar to the same way that a narcissistic personality operates. narcissistic people need constant validation and admiration. They need a constant source of narcissistic supply. Otherwise, they become dysregulated. They can't regulate their own internal world without that constant stream of validation. And, you know, with people who are hyper obsessed with identity politics on the left, it's sort of a replacement for the development of a healthy personality. Most people who I meet IRL around, who are from marginalized or, you know, backgrounds that aren't necessarily hegemonic, don't actually form their entire personality around being that thing. They just are that thing, and they happen to be cool or interested in this activity or interested in that activity. They're multifaceted, multidimensional like people, and there are a lot of people out there who are not multidimensional and who don't have a strong sense of self, and who are looking for some form of identity and community to sort of latch onto. So they do that kind of self-abandonment and latch on to, you know, a specific identity category or highlight a specific identity category within themselves. And because it's like unstable and insecure, it needs that constant sense of validation and recognition in order to sustain itself. And anything that doesn't do that, anything that doesn't meet those requirements, is met with disdain, punishment, punitive action, abuse, threats. And I see this happening all the time when, you know, these sorts of identity categories are not treated the way that they want to be or demand to be treated in reality, like the whole aromantic thing, you know? Like you said, someone's inability to form romantic connections isn't everyone else's problem. It simply isn't. And it's also not an oppressed category. It sort of makes mockery of the concept of oppression, in my opinion. It's not an oppressed category. You may suffer some mild cultural dysfunction because there's a lot of, you know, cultural, you know, notions around love and romance and this and that. But everybody feels some type of way about those things. And love and sexuality are inherently exclusive concepts. They're not going to be inclusive. Like the way gay men talk about love and romance isn't going to include me. It's not going to, and I don't feel offended by that, and I don't feel oppressed by that. But it's this sort of, you know, my identity is my entire being, and I need you to validate it. I need you to include me. I need you to think about me. I need you to pay attention to me. I need you to see me as special and significant. And that is kind of at the crux of it. That's at the core of this kind of dysfunctional mode and personality style. And it's sad that it's difficult to call it out, because a lot of these people, and it's also kind of a trend among narcissists, is they like to do strength of weakness. So if you call them out on their bullshit, you become the perpetrator, you become the abuser, even though what they're doing is abusive. It's gaslighting us, and it's also taking advantage of and making a mockery of the natural empathy that we have towards people. It's sort of taking advantage of your empathic ability to want to take care of someone in order to extract narcissistic supply from you. So really and truly, they're the abusers, they're the fucked up ones, but they make you feel like you're the abuser and you're the fucked up one if you call this stuff out, which is why most people just kind of bow their heads and avoid it.
That's a really good way of putting that. I see a lot, or a while ago, I saw a lot of that stuff going on. Every group I'm in, they like will fall apart after like some type of ace discourse or aromantic discourse, and I like it's really concerning to me because you know, like I don't know how you could be, if you're asexual and you're aromantic, I don't know how you're LGBT. Like you don't fuck, you're not attracted to people.
No one's ever persecuted you for that.
I have police ever raided a book club? I don't know.
No.
You know, like
Yeah.
I mean, well, maybe like if you're reading something like with hammers and sickles on it in 1940 Germany, like I can, you know, but I just don't see it's frustrating because I'm sure that it's frustrating. I don't know quite how to describe how it makes me frustrated, but it does seem
It's the
like,
feeling, it's that feeling of ickiness you get when you're being subject to narcissistic abuse.
yeah,
Because somebody is trying to weaponize your own empathy against you, which is
right.
precisely why it causes that kind of icky reaction. Because none of us are bad people. We all want to, you know, include people and be sensitive to people's proclivities.
Right.
Like,
Like,
none of us are.
sorry.
Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say I almost feel like they want to make you feel bad.
Yeah.
For like, oh, you're in love. Well,
Yeah.
I'm not. So
Yeah.
you need to like
Yeah.
center your whole like. You better like acknowledge that like I don't date, or I don't have the capacity to love someone, because
Yeah.
that's what matters, because I'm
Yeah.
oppressed.
And then
Yeah.
It's like,
and then
it
they'll
doesn't
come
make
out
any
and
sense.
say, then they'll come out and say things like, yeah, ace people can, you know, have sex sometimes, or like
Yeah.
romantic people can have a boyfriend, and I'm just like,
It's just it's narcissism. Like, to be honest, like, if you've ever been subject to being friends with a narcissist, or having a parent who's a narcissist, or being in a relationship with someone who's a narcissist, like, you'll know this sort of gaslighting technique, and how they sort of try to weaponize your own empathy against you. Say you feel like something is wrong, or you're unsettled, you try and bring it up, and then all of a sudden you're the bad guy, you're the perpetrator. You're not taking my, you know, past wounds into account, or you're not taking my depression. Like, they self-victimize. They then sort of make you question your view of reality, and also the validity of your own, you know, emotional reaction to whatever. And it's what we're going through right now is like a mass gaslighting. It's like gaslighting en masse. And it's very difficult to push back against. I mean, when the whole AOC thing happened, where she was like, I was murdered, like, it's again, it's strength of weakness. It's like the primary sort of go-to of these narcissistic personalities. And when they employ strength of weakness, it's very difficult to get past it, because then it seems as if culturally you are, you know, victimizing somebody who has already been victimized, or you're not paying enough attention to somebody's claims. Whereas these are usually very powerful people in very privileged positions, which is why it's strength of weakness. There's the strength element, because they're oftentimes culturally connected, wealthy, powerful people that are trying to sort of take on this victim status, because it gives them a sort of strength over people. And it's a terrifying tactic that's constantly employed by the synthetic left, and it's difficult to get through, because none of us want to look like assholes. But I feel like it's time to get assholey. Like, more people need to be brave about being the asshole.
That's how I've been feeling a lot lately. With talking, like, with Joe Biden. Like, I've seen so much, like, on Twitter and on Facebook, like in my own circles, of people saying like, oh, well, at least Trump's not in office, you know, and it doesn't matter. Like, that's the point. He's not in office anymore. Now it's the guy you voted for. So he's still bombing people. He's still deporting people. Like, what aren't you getting here? And so, you know, I've made a couple positions where I've said, like, if you like flat out just support the president, you're a racist piece of shit. And people don't like that. They don't like that. They don't. And I think it's really dangerous to keep saying like, oh, things would have gotten worse under Trump, but they're still deteriorating under Joe Biden. And
but it challenges and ruptures at their self-perception of themselves as moral creatures, as these sort of bastions of morality and liberal values. So anything at all that gets in the way of that deluded self-perception, you know, is an enemy. Like, there's the friend-enemy distinction is so sharp. You're either on our side or you're not on our side. You're either friend or you're foe. And anything that tries to sort of puncture the grandiose view that they have of themselves becomes an enemy in that sense, and becomes a threat to them. And that's the reason why these people are able to act out in the most punitive, ugly ways because they believe they have the moral justification to do so. Like, look at what happened after the Capitol riots happened. You had people who were celebrating extrajudicial killings. You had people who were, celebrating corporate censorship, celebrating, the fucking stormtroopers storming around fucking DC, because any measure that they take to protect their view of reality is justified, no matter how, against their principles it may seem, against the principles they espouse it may seem. It went from being all cops are bad to, oh yay, let's turn people into the FBI. It's a completely, it was a completely, like, it's a completely narcissistic and infantile view of reality. And the reason why this is so rife within the political domain is because it's the type of people that are unfortunately attracted to the political domain a lot of the time. It's a place for them to sort of create these larger than life grandiose personas where they are these sort of very moral actors who are very concerned with like the plight of humanity and all that stuff, while also continuing to source narcissistic supply from like an adoring audience. And like
they do the same thing with foreign policy. It's almost like the inversion, right? Where they'll like push the narrative that like there's a human rights abuse happening, and if you don't believe what mainstream media is saying about it, and you bring up sources that aren't mainstream media, you're like denying genocide, or like if you ask questions about what the ruling class is saying, you're denying genocide and stuff. And then they try to come at you at your moral character and your values. And they really do want to make them like themselves be, they want social clout on the internet. And like it's so frustrating because half the time they're like endorsing Al-Qaeda, like they don't even know it. And it just disgusts me, and it really frustrates me because you could paint this whole picture of like, here are these historical things that line up really well that disagree with what the media is telling you to believe right now. But if you question the media, you're a fascist. And I don't know.
It's all indicative of like a sort of mode of narcissistic abuse. The smear campaigns, the gaslighting, this is all stuff that like victims of narcissistic abuse, on a personal level go through, but it's just sort of happening on a grand scale. And now this synthetic left mode has been handed all of the tools to continue to sort of perpetuate narcissistic abuse on anything that's like dissent. So not only do they have they manufactured the sort of moral consent to call everything that's like a form of dissent fascism, they are also backed by a censorious Silicon Valley, where they can punitively take away people's platforms with very little due process.
I swear half these accounts are just ops. Like that. I'm close friends with a couple people who are they're aromantic. Like they like rarely post about it online. They don't make it a full personality. They just live their lives. Okay? So that's one thing I noticed is like, and then the other thing I noticed is like, especially on Twitter, all these like cat anime picture thing. I was like, is this account even real? is there really a person behind like I'm suspicious. I'm suspicious because the people who I know who are ace and aromantic, and this is just my perception, like this is my perception, right? Even the people I know who identify that way, they don't behave like this. They don't behave like this. And these leftist groups just fall apart at the seams when you bring this issue up.
Well,
and like that. Go ahead, Eric.
Sorry, no, I think that's what postmodernism was designed to do, and I think a lot of people that that kind of really play into like this whole postmodernism movement don't really realize the roots of postmodernism and how it was funded by the CIA to like combat Marxism and materialist analysis of things. So
I mean, academia is rife with this sort of post-structuralist, postmodern view, and that's where a lot of this identity fetishism comes from.
Yeah,
And it's
and it like it exacerbates this narcissistic attitude and mindset in people, because what it teaches you is that, oh, there's no objective truth.
yeah,
It's your narrative. This is
yeah,
all about narratives, and there's no objective truth. And anyone who talks
mhm,
about a collective or has a class
mhm,
analysis, they're fascists, they're
mhm,
authoritarians, they're,
yep,
They're
you
the
know,
Borg. They're
you
the
know.
fucking Borg.
So, when they're those that think that really believe in this postmodernism crap, when their perceived reality isn't really matching
mhm,
reality, it
mhm.
makes them go crazy.
Crazy. But
Makes them
that's
go crazy.
exactly, it's exactly the sort of neurosis within the narcissist. I don't know if you've ever challenged somebody who's a narcissist or
Uh,
given them a narcissistic injury, which is what it's like deemed psychologically. Whenever whenever narcissists suffer narcissistic injury, they immediately resort to these sort of infantile, unregulated behaviors like rage, or like trying, or smear campaigns, or gaslighting, or passive aggression. It's a sort of dysregulated response to the internal perception of themselves, this sort of internal mask that they put on to mask their actual insecurities, being met with a cold, hard reality. And the sort of post-structuralist paradigm and postmodern paradigm, these people are trained in it in academia, and it's one of the ugliest things that's ever happened to the liberal arts, in my opinion, and also other fields of study, because it completely untethers one from the historical continuum. A lot of these people have no knowledge of history. They have absolutely no knowledge of like anthropology. They have no knowledge of They have no knowledge of anything outside of the kind of post-structuralist analysis of society and of culture and of art and all of these different things. And they're sort of psychologically impoverished because of it, and they're also culturally impoverished because of it. And they look at the past and with kick, they look at the past as if it's with contempt. And they look at the past as if everything, it was just this, the entire history of humanity, this awful reactionary plague.
yeah.
And this moment that we're in now, that the present is the most progressive, but at the same time, even though they're living in this eternal present, there's no sort of view of posterity or the future. They don't think about posterity, they don't think about the future, they don't think about their responsibility within the present in order to perpetuate a good future, not just for progeny, but for humanity in general. So it's a very sort of the postmodern post-structuralist view is incredibly narcissistic. There's nothing but the eternal present, and I'm the shaper of reality, and I am the one who and it's all about my instant gratifications and needs, and other people are just vessels to either validate me or give me the supply that I need in order to get my needs met. And that's why narcissism is endemic, because that's how a lot of these people think unconsciously. And that is the narcissistic psyche. Everybody is a means to an end. I'm the most important thing. I am the shaper of reality. I can shape reality through my words and what I say and what I enforce and the modes that I create. And it's something that needs to be harshly put up to reality. But I feel like a lot of people shy away from doing it because the abuse that you're subject to when you try to put these people in touch with reality is severe. And it's something that I've gone through since I started like doing this, since I started like being public and political, because I've always sort of been hostile towards this mode. The amount of abuse, almost like, I don't blame people for shying away from it, because it's so entrenched, it's so endemic, it's so powerful, and these people will do, and this mode will do anything to protect itself. There's nothing that's like beyond it in order to protect itself. So I do understand why a lot of people shy away from trying to make reality assert itself, because it's incredibly difficult these days.
Yeah. Fox, do you want to ask the
Yeah,
Or
yeah, yeah.
next
Let's
topic?
switch up topics here.
Beautifully
Thank
said.
you for laying all that out. Like
It's
you
all
said
good.
so wonderfully. Thank
It's
you
all
for
good.
addressing some of these issues and dealing with them on almost a daily basis. I'm sure that's not fun at all. So, moving on, another issue that you have some knowledge on are things that are happening in Nigeria. What is your connection to this particular issue? Can you tell us a bit about what's going on, especially regarding SARS?
Okay, no problem. So I am my mom's side of the family is originally Nigerian, but we're like third generation migrants to the UK. So I still have very deep sort of roots culturally in Nigeria, but I'm also like very English at the same time. I've also lived in America too, so there's that kind of hangover. Yeah, I went to high school in the States and lived like between here and there for a while. Um and yeah, but my roots are still quite deeply tethered in Nigeria. But yeah, last year the End SARS campaign caught the attention of the Western media, which was I was surprised about because nobody ever gives a fuck about what's going on in Africa ever. But the reason that it sort of caught the attention of the Western media is because it's very much heavily involved a lot of the sort of Nigerian bourgeoisie, a sort of class of Nigerians, like myself, whose parents are educated professionals who were raised abroad, and there's been a massive influx of those types of you know, expat kids leaving once they've gotten their education in the West, leaving the West and going back to Nigeria in order to sort of seek business opportunities. And then they get there and they're like, oh, whoa, this place has social problems. Because a lot of them are sort of filter Africa and Africanness through the Western gaze. Like they watch Black Panther,
Yeah.
and they start to romanticize Africa, and they think that, I'm going back to the motherland where I'm always going to be understood and I'm going to be accepted. And they really buy the notion of Blackness as like this like permanently racialized category, even though Blackness is something that is amorphous and only really exists within the minds of the Westerners. Like the average actual African does not understand the concept of Blackness and does not view themselves as a racialized subject. But it sort of comes into conflict with a lot of these kids who are raised abroad in the West, where they are racialized subjects, and then go back to Africa, and they sort of take that same mentality and try to superimpose it onto the different sort of social problems that go on in Africa. And SARS happened and it caught the attention of the Western media mainly because a lot of those sort of educated, social media savvy expat kids basically made a huge stink about the whole situation on social media, and obviously it caught attention. But SARS stands for the Special Anti-Armed Robbery Unit. And it was a division set up by the Nigerian government in the 90s, I believe, because there was a huge issue with like armed robbery taking place, specifically done by either military or ex-military people. And basically, our economy is mostly privatized. Like Africa, lots of countries in Africa, but especially Nigeria, would be considered like a libertarian paradise. So, the private sector and private individuals take care of a lot of stuff. Government infrastructure is like either crumbling or non-existent. And especially when it comes to army and law enforcement, these people are often underpaid, poorly treated. Their barracks are also in terrible squalid living conditions. And a lot of them resort to armed robbery and, using the sort of de facto state power they have in order to sort of extort money from the public. And this has been the way ever since, like, British independence, after we got our independence from the British happened. And it's been the way for a very long time in sort of post-colonial or traditional colonial anyway, African countries. And, SARS, the police force, began to act corruptly in the same way, like extorting people, using the power that they're given by the state to rob people. But they mostly sort of pick on rich expats. So one of the first cases that caught social media attention was a luxury SUV that was stolen. And they tend to go after, you know, Western looking kids, like Nigerian kids, like the ones that come with like the tattoos and the dreadlocks or have some sort of outlandish fashion statement to make and who are flashy and rich. Those are the ones who tend to get targeted, and they're oftentimes brutalized and violently sort of, handled by this police force. And that was what basically sparked the whole thing. Was there were a handful of incidents where wealthy expats or wealthy Nigerians, you know, fell under the hands of the SARS unit. And there was also a couple of incidents as well that really sparked a lot of social media attention, which then sort of snowballed and got attracted into the West. And they, you know, the Nigerian activists sort of tried to have this whole Black Lives Matter kind of like veneer to the whole thing that was going on, even though it doesn't make sense in that context. And a lot of the issues are to do with like government corruption, privatization, lack of government resources that are being put towards things like paying police, you know, corruption within the police force. These are all the different sort of things. And the Nigerian police is very brutal, more brutal than the Western police. Like if you want to see Black bodies being brutalized, go to Africa. If you think that the stuff you see on social media with like the George Floyds of the world is brutal, see what they do to people in Nigeria. It's 10 times more brutal than anything you'll see. And I think it was very shocking for a lot of these sort of expat kids to see that they see racial quote unquote profiling going on with police in the West, and then they go back to Nigeria or other places in Africa and expect it to be this sort of Black utopia. And in a lot of times it's worse, especially because of the different economic and class forces that are operating behind it. But there was no analysis of the history of the country or any of that. They just sort of tried to superimpose this kind of Black Lives Matter kind of activism sort of stint to it. And it got a little bit of attention in the Western media and then immediately fizzled out.
That's so yeah, I'm not sure how to follow that up. That's a lot.
Yeah, sorry, I just like unloaded. It's a big issue. It's like a lot to cover.
I mean, this is an issue I honestly have not heard a lot about. But
because I feel like it's still ongoing. It's still ongoing, even though am I correct that it's been disbanded, but they're still operating it under different.
Yeah, it's been disbanded, but they're still operating under different sort of pretense. The Nigerian government basically did as much as it needed to in order to sort of get the ire off of their back. But at the end of the day, the extortion that goes on is what keeps the paramilitary sort of body afloat. So without it, there would be, it's not as if the Nigerian government is going to make efforts in order to sort of properly fund police forces and to put more government money and infrastructure into law enforcement. They're just going to make these sort of symbolic gestures. And really and truly, their hands are tied. They can't. I mean, because of the forces of neo-colonialism, you know, having government funded public amenities like police, education, hospitals are next to impossible in a lot of different places in Africa, because we're forced to keep our markets completely free most of the time. So, and that, you know, and also not just that, the corruption of the elites as well. Most of the government resources are pocketed by people in power. So the only thing that could really be, you know, any sort of redress for this issue would be total systemic overhaul in terms of the police and in terms of the funding of the police and all of those different things. However, that's not going to happen. So it's just going to be business as usual.
Yeah, and people don't really realize that it's a military dictatorship.
Yeah, and it has been for a very long time as well. And we've been under military dictatorship, you know, serious military dictatorship on and off since, you know, the end of British rule and end of British colonization. And a lot of the people, the like, you know, expat kids that move there also don't know this. They think they're dealing with like a Western liberal democracy, and then they go there and they're sort of slapped in the face by the brutal reality of, like, you know, military dictatorship and corrupt elites that have inordinate amounts of power to silence and bully anyone that they want to. And they try to sort of put this sort of Western liberal activist lens on a very sort of deep systemic issue.
Yeah, so thank you for shedding some light on that, and giving us some insight to some African politics. Something that you said that I thought was really interesting that I wanted to bring up was so since the beginning of the year, we have like bombed Somalia 6 times, and I think 3 or 4 have been under Biden since inauguration. And I learned that the president of Somalia, until 2019, had a dual American citizenship.
Wow.
And he went to university here. He grew up here. And then he moved to Somalia. And apparently people like directly in his administration were like giving weapons to terrorist groups, which sounds very CIA kind of shit, you know, definitely really suspicious. So these are issues that, because you're also right, like people really don't talk about African politics, and especially after Gaddafi was taken out, you know. And so I think that
it's because the majority of shit that is wrong, and the majority of the problems are sort of rooted in neocolonialism,
right?
Which a lot of these Western, and also not just neocolonialism, the way that neocolonialism exploits already existing tensions within Africa. I can talk about Nigeria specifically because obviously that's where I'm from, and there's always been sort of tribal disputes between the Igbos, Yorubas, and the Hausas. And one of the things that the British colonial powers did in order to sort of maintain their power was sort of triangulation and an exacerbation of these sort of ethnic conflicts that had been going on. So on the ground, you have all these ethnic conflicts that have been exacerbated and sort of played up by neocolonial forces. You have neocolonialism, which is sort of extractive and economically exploitative. And those things actually prevent these African nations from being able to actually be nations or perform like nations, or to have anything that even resembles a welfare state, or to even have basic infrastructure like roads that aren't privatized, or transportation systems that aren't privatized. In Africa, you see people doing all of these really makeshift sort of private solutions in order for society to run. So in Nigeria, there still isn't 24-hour electricity. So if you have the money, most people will have a generator. Most rich people and most people who are sort of from the gentry sort of middle class will have a generator and, you know, diesel, and use all of these different sort of get around methods to sort of get around the failing infrastructure. And that's kind of what we're in right now, and that's how it works. And the reason why there isn't much Western interest in talking about Africa is obvious, because it would mean having to critique the way that the West is sort of extracting and exploiting and preventing these nations from being able to operate as nations.
Because and what you said about the ethnic tensions, because capitalism creates racism to keep people fighting against each other and maintain hegemony for the ruling class, to keep, so that they could keep their monopoly on violence and secure their wealth. And that's a very class reductionist take, apparently. So I don't know how relevant that particular point I just made is to what's happening in Africa versus the United States. But I just thought that was really, really interesting how you framed that.
Yeah, massively. It is those exacerbated tensions are what enable the exploitation to sort of easily perpetuate itself. I mean, among the Yorubas, Igbos, and Hausas, like Nigeria doesn't really actually even exist. It's a, you know, the British colonialists came and drew a line around specific territories. We were like, this is Nigeria now, even though they have ethnic differences, cultural differences, religious differences. Like the Hausa North is largely Muslim, the Yoruba South is largely Christian. You know, and they, you know, these lines and boundaries that were sort of drawn didn't take into account ethnic differences. It didn't take into account language differences, cultural differences, all of these different things. And they did it as a sort of triangulation, divide and conquer chaos tactic. And I mean, the same lens can be applied to the way identity politics is also historically manifested itself in the West. It was first used as a way of, you know, creating a permanent underclass for capitalist exploitation. That's the whole reason the concept of race was invented in the first place. And now it's being used to divide and prevent, and sort of it's being used as a justifying ideology to prevent, you know, solidarity among the working class. And it's also being used as a moral cover as well for the ruling class. So these different sort of ideologies serve their function for the status quo in certain ways, but it's unfortunate that people aren't really looking to sort of penetrate these ideologies and examine them deeper than just surface level.
Yeah, and I think the more attention that the West, or specifically that the U.S. media would bring, if they were to bring more attention to what's going on in Africa, I think a lot of people would really see the contrast between the U.S. being the imperial empire that it is, and China, the socialist state that's helping not underdeveloped China, or not underdeveloped Africa, which, you know, that's what imperialism is doing. That's what the U.S. is doing, but it's actually helping build up Africa. And I think if people were to see that contrast, it might raise some more eyebrows.
It's sort of a difficult subject to broach for me, because because China also has kind of a bit of a place in Nigeria now at the moment, and I have, like, you know, quite a few family members who have had interactions because of business and all kinds of other things with different Chinese entities that are out there at the moment, and it's difficult to broach because I don't know, I'm not an expert, but at the same time, it's still the feeling on the ground is that it's still exploitation, but it's like exploitation with like a smilier, not as harsh face. But I guess because there's a lot of argument that goes on about China, my whole thing is pick your poison. Like, are you going? It's either fucking Western neoliberal like dystopia, or it's like Chinese state capitalism. Like, which neither of them are better than the other, in my opinion. You know, each of them has like serious, like fucked up, like flaws and serious avenues that can become exploitative. So it's kind of like a pick your poison. And I guess a lot of the attitude on the ground in different parts of Africa is they would rather go with the poison that isn't as explicitly corrosive, because of how long they've sort of been under the heel of Western brutal colonialism, whether it be through actual colonialism or the neo-colonialism that's like done through the IMF and all of these different entities. You know, it seems more attractive, but I'm still suspicious. I'm not like gonna throw my hat in and say China is the answer to all of the ills in Africa.
Right.
I'm
Obviously,
not gonna.
The solution would, you know, Africans having control over their own
and self-determination.
Right.
And self-determination, like the fact that we were not able to behave like sovereign nations, and that we have all of these massive colonial blockades, neo-colonial blockades on our ability to have things like functioning infrastructure. The fact that the majority of the education in Nigeria is education that you have to pay for. There's no sort of, the state schooling is not a thing. Like, you either have money or you die. That's how it works in Africa. and like, you know, the our markets are sort of forcefully kept free, and a lot of the money that should go towards public amenities and development is absorbed by greedy, corrupt elites at the behest of, you know, the colonial powers that are under control. And a lot of the development you do see taking place is from the private sector, and not necessarily sort of collective government, you know, programs in that sense. And that's the reason why I'm not gonna say, you know, China's like, it's either, you know, China's doing its thing, yes, but it's not the answer to the problems that are facing Africa. And it would be remiss to say that there isn't an element of exploitation to certain things that are going on with China in Africa. Is it as bad as what's going on with West? Hell no, definitely not. But it's not ideal that we are not able to self-determine either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting too, like the level of severity that the liberals and the synthetic left will use to talk about China, who are really, you know, they're only doing business in like three or four countries in Africa, whereas like nations like Canada have like the most mining companies in the world, and most of them are in Africa, and that's like part of the point. Like people who want to make lives better for their citizens, they have a choice to make, and it's either go with the IMF or go with China, who's going to write off their debt in 10 years.
Yeah.
Well, right. Yeah. I mean, and the Belt and Road Initiative is such a positive project, I think. And like, you know, there's a huge difference because China is not going in there and propping up their own governments. You know, they're not like backing, or they're not propping up puppet regimes there. They're, from what I understand, they're going in and building up infrastructure there and leaving. You know, they're not
necessary to do it.
Right.
China has one military base outside of China, and where did Caleb say that was? I don't remember.
Yeah, I forget too.
I don't remember.
But it's projection on their part. It's easier to sort of point over there than like to sort of
exactly
look at yourself. So there's a lot of projection that goes on in that sense. But the ultimate goal is or the ultimate desire is for Africa to become a self-determined, and not Africa as a whole, like all these different African nations, to become self-determined and to be able to have functioning economies that are self-sustainable. That's the ultimate hope or wish. I honestly, as the trajectory of things are going, I don't have much hope of that happening unless there's a massive sort of like, you know, massive workers movement that like spreads, or unless there's a massive kind of systemic shift that, you know, enables a certain shift in consciousness to occur. But I don't have a whole lot of hope about, you know, that happening. I think that Africa is going to, it's going to take a lot for these sorts of outside forces to not hold as much sway as they currently do, because at this point so much damage has been done, and there are so many different cultures that have been ingrained in terms of how the governments operate, and a lot of the brutal power that keeps the people down is also backed by the West, which is far more powerful than, you know, the people themselves. So it's kind of a depressing thing to think about. But it's not a good scene at all.
I mean, well, I know the I know I don't have any stake in any African country, but I see I see hope. I see a future where all people can have self-determination, and I know it really seems kind of bleak for us right now because maybe it won't happen in our lifetimes, but I feel like culturally, at least here in the United States, we're at a huge tipping point. And I feel like that could shift things all over the world. I mean, when 9/11 happened, like the entire world was like paying attention, right? And so I think that, I don't know, I think we're close to something. like within the next 20 years, maybe sooner, you know, hopefully. But I definitely feel some of that disdain for the future at the same time, especially with like these huge colonial powers still trying to like own other human beings. I see a lot of that happening in the United Kingdom right now, especially post-Brexit with the YesCymru movement and Yes Scotland. I see a lot of like English people saying, no, we own you. Like you can't leave, we own you. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, what do you know about the independence movements in the UK, and how are Londoners or English people responding to it in the media?
Well, being the solipsistic Londoner that I am, you know, you're talking to the wrong person. I'm Southern English Londoner, like born and bred, which is like the seat and sort of, you know, the central area of empire. Literally, I'm right in the center of it. If this was Lord of the Rings, I'd be in the heart of Mount Doom, like
Yes.
literally. Literally, the eye of Sauron looks down upon me every single day.
I see you.
And you know, the peasants out in the Shire are having their little revolt right now, and they're saying that that's literally how the people here view it. Basically, I don't think anyone really takes these independence movements very seriously in the South, especially in London. Because there's been pushes for it, you know, historically, you know, that people are sort of paying reference to. And the English, I don't want to say British, the English establishment specifically is has been so savvy historically at sort of quelling this discontent when it arrives. And especially because we're coming off the left in the UK as well, especially because we're coming off the back of a massive defeat, a historical defeat with Corbyn. There's a sense of demoralization in the air, in that sense.
Yeah.
And there's also a split within the left as well, because historically the position of socialists in the UK has been anti-EU and anti-Brexit. Has been has been anti-EU and pro-Brexit. And then obviously you have the more liberal left that have been pro-EU and sort of anti-Brexit. And those are the sort of two factions that have been warring. And I say left with quotation marks because obviously you have like the actual sort of left, and then you've got like the perception of what the left is in culture, which is the liberal left. And there's been sort of a warring between these factions in terms of you know, the Brexit and these different things, and the independence movements, and you know, and whether or not these things are going to catch sway, especially off the back of this like historical Corbyn defeat, and because Brexit is like going through now. And you know, instead of one of my major disappointments is that Jeremy Corbyn took an ambivalent stance towards Brexit. I think that that's what fucked him. Because it was what the majority of the nation voted for, number one. And number two, because it was like sort of the traditional socialist line, and he could have done a better job, in my opinion, of seeing Brexit through than the Tories, who are just gonna, it's like, if Brexit is gonna happen, I would rather have, you know, someone like Jeremy Corbyn behind it than Boris Johnson and his cronies, the Tories. The way that they're sort of leaving the EU is, of course, going to be a lot less conscientious. It's going to have a lot more of a punitive effect on the more vulnerable populations, not just within England, but also within other parts of the UK as well. And you know, they have the power to do those things. They have the power to ignore those concerns. It's about power at the end of the day. And at this point, they have carte blanche to do basically whatever the fuck they want. I am reluctant now. I mean, especially because of the, you know, massive historical defeats that have just happened, of what could have sort of been an inkling of a sort of thing that was sympathetic to the left within the electoral sphere. Now that has sort of gone the way of the dogs and was totally publicly humiliated and just rat-fucked and, you know, done, I'm sort of reluctant to be enthusiastically behind anything as of now. I'm in thinking mode and reflecting mode and in analysis mode, and I feel like everybody has the right to do that, rather than just sort of trying to jump to the next vision or dream or version of utopianism. There needs to be a certain amount of humility and self-reflection and also caution, because one of the things that happens when people become disillusioned is that the neoliberal mode is able to sort of further entrench itself and compound itself in that sort of vacuum of disillusionment. So the more disillusioned and disappointed people get, the more, you know, they see that these things fall apart and not work, the more kind of room it leaves for, you know, disillusionment to occur. So I'm sort of just observing at the moment in terms of what's going on. But I understand the grievances, and I think it's admirable, but I'm not necessarily I'm still kind of watching it with a kind of a skeptical eye. But what are your thoughts? What do you think?
So my a lot of my ancestry comes from Wales, so I and Scotland. So I I am very pro self-determination for them, and I think it's really important to support these movements because it weakens the imperial core, and that to me would make, I mean, no country that has left the United Kingdom has wanted to go back. So I think it's pretty safe to say that we've surpassed the need for the United Kingdom and the English crown, and that, you know, as an American also, you know, we fought a war to leave. We tried everything to leave peacefully, and we were like, no, we're done with this. It was a bourgeois revolution, but I think it's really important to pay attention to those movements, because how did the English react when Ireland was getting self-determination? They responded with brute force, and they were at war. And I think that in order to,
I don't think it would be brute force again, though. Like, the English have basically refined soft power at this point and economic pressure. And that's like my primary concern, because
exactly,
even though England is lost most of its colonial territories, you know, there's still an element of dominion that England still has over most of these places. Like, for instance, the Crown is still a major landowner in places like Australia, in
Jamaica,
places like Canada, Jamaica, in lots of different places in Africa, in India. So in terms of the economic power that Britain,
right?
Yeah, the Commonwealth countries, yeah. The economic power that Britain still has, and the influence and the soft power that they still wield over these territories, makes one understand that independence was really more or less a symbolic gesture, than anything that actually like yielded anything tangible or beneficial for the proletariat. It may have yielded something tangible or beneficial for the bourgeoisie, and you know, who were sort of kind of carving out their own slice of the pie. When it comes to the sort of working class and the proletariat of these different territories, there was no real change, just a new sort of feudal overlord in terms of their bourgeoisie.
Yeah, that's something I'm noticing about YesCymru, is that their focus is more on getting independence, than they don't take any like really hardline stances on like workers' rights or anything like that. This is just from what I've seen.
Yeah,
like they're not a socialist party.
No.
And I'm not seeing a lot. I mean, Wales is already very left wing. I mean, they've never voted for a Tory government, but they always get one anyway. And so I think that the assumption that a lot of people have based off of the little discourse I've tuned into, is that Wales is already left wing.
Yeah.
So I think people are assuming or hoping that it's gonna shift. Like, you're shaking your head. Yeah.
No. You
Yeah.
know what I would like to see? Because I mean, in terms of like the boundaries of like the United Kingdom, there are some very important symbiotic relationships there economically that are vital.
Mhm.
However, what I would like to see are the working class of England, Ireland, and Wales banding together and their power and their resources in order to face off the English, specifically the English establishment. Like the English are suffering under the English establishment, for fuck's sake. Working class English people are also being, you know, maligned and exploited and completely and utterly sort of left to die at the wayside by the English establishment. The English establishment is just as cruel to the English poor and working class as it is to the working class globally. I mean, even during the Industrial Revolution, when colonial expansion was happening, the majority of the poor and working class English were dying in workhouses. You know, the English have always been brutal and exploitative to their poor and working class. So the idea of secession to me seems more like a sort of noble fantasy than something that's actually grounded in the political realities and economic realities of the United Kingdom at the moment. And the United Kingdom, like I said, has some very important symbiotic economic relationships, especially now that we've left the EU, that are important to pay attention to. And I feel like some of these secession efforts are kind of a flex of the bourgeoisie in certain cases. But I don't want to be overly pessimistic. Like I said, I'm in analysis mode, and I'm in watching mode, and I'm in hypervigilance mode. Because I'm not going to be quick to throw my hat into something that will just get all of the energy absorbed back into the neoliberal establishment. That's exactly what people did with Corbyn. It's exactly what people did with Bernie. People were out, you know, donating money, pounding the pavements, giving over free labor and alienated time, and, you know, all of these different things. And all of it got funneled back into with Black Lives Matter, all of these things, it all got funneled back into like the DNC. So, you know, I feel like a time of like reflection and critical examining of things needs to be in full effect, because what else is Marxism but a ruthlessly critical examination of, you know, economics and culture and all of these different things. That I feel like we need to be there needs to be a lot more sort of circumspect navigation of the emerging political terrain, because there's a lot of uncharted, unknown territory, and there are also a lot of new problems that we're facing as well. And there's also a lot of stumbling blocks and also ideological roadblocks that need to be unpicked and examined as well. So yeah, I'm reluctant to sort of dive headfirst into anything at the moment, and I think that's okay, considering the traumatic shit that has just unfolded. And, you know, like, you know, I feel like we need to, you know, really be critically examining everything, even more so now than ever before.
I absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Especially before you dive headfirst into something. I think it's really important to be really, really critical and investigative when you have the energy for it, of course. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Angie, I think this is a really good spot to wrap up. We are like I love this conversation that we just had with you. I really hope that when I move to Cardiff, we can hang out and like make everything problematic.
Let's do it. No, don't worry. I'm gonna come to Chicago and I'll come and see you. Don't worry. But also, I'm so happy because it gives me an excuse to go back to Cardiff. I've been wanting to go back there for so long. So yeah, you'll definitely see me.
Well, you
hit me up.
Well, you give me an excuse to go back to London. So
yes. Come visit me as well. I will take good care of you. I will be your trad wife, mommy.
Yes, please.
I'll do
I'm
it.
up for adoption. I'm 32, but I'm still up for adoption. So that works.
No problem. No problem.
Angie, could you remind our viewers where they can find your work?
Thank you.
Before we sign off.
Thank you so much. So my channel is called Angie Speaks. And I am also at Speaks Angie on Twitter, and I also have a podcast called Low Society that I do with my partner Jake and Peter Coffin. So yeah, you can find me there. Thank you so much for having me, you guys. This is a really great conversation as well.
Thank you, Angie. We are so thrilled to have you.
Yeah, I'm beyond thrilled. We love you, and keep up the amazing work that you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.
Bye.